On October the 1st, 1950, a large crowd filled Tiananmen Square in Beijing. They were celebrating the first anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. The joyous occasion was marked by music and cheering. From the podium on the Gate of Heavenly Peace, Mao Zedong delivered a speech. He and the other Chinese leaders seemed relaxed. But their calm exterior belied their knowledge of a threat the fledgling People's Republic was facing to its very existence. By October the 1st, war had been raging on the Korean peninsula for over 3 months. With the tide turning against his forces, Kim Il-sung, leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, wrote to Mao Zedong, asking for military assistance. "We are obliged to ask for your special help. In the event of an enemy attack north of the 38th parallel, we very much hope that the Chinese People's Liberation Army will assist our forces." On the same day, Mao Zedong also received a telegram from Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. "If you consider it possible to send troops to assist the Koreans, then you should move at least 5 to 6 divisions towards the 38th parallel at once." On the first anniversary of its founding, the nascent state received letters from the leaders of 2 of its neighbors asking for military assistance. How had this come about? The Korean peninsula lies in Northeast Asia, bordering China and the former Soviet Union. In 1910, Korea had been annexed by Japan. Following the Japanese surrender in August 1945, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel into US and Soviet spheres of influence. On August the 15th, 1948, the Republic of Korea, with Syngman Rhee as its president, was established in the southern half of the peninsula. Less than a month later, on September the 9th, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was founded in the north under the leadership of Kim Il-sung.
1948年的下半年，苏联军队从北方撤出了；1949年的上半年，美国军队从南方撤出了。南方、北方这2个政府是互不承认，但是又都宣布它是代表整个朝鲜半岛。南北双方都想求得整个半岛的统一。
On June the 25th, 1950, a Sunday, civil war broke out on the Korean peninsula.
中国当时知道朝鲜战争爆发是通过外电知道的。
中国政府的态度，这场战争那是朝鲜自己的事务，外国不应该干涉。中国也没有干涉。但是这个时候，毛泽东已经预言到，事情可能复杂化。
During this blessed month of Ramadan, our families are gathering every night around the breakfast table. But our brothers and sisters.
但是这个时候，毛泽东已经预言到，事情可能复杂化。
The day after the outbreak of war, the United States sprang into action, mobilizing its naval and air forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur.
So MacArthur understood that if America didn't get involved straight away, then the war would be won. The North would occupy the whole peninsula, and it'd be very difficult then to retake the South. It'd be much more controversial to then get involved when the fighting had actually been concluded. So it was essentially a very rapid decision taken, one that essentially was probably illegal in international law as well. It wasn't a UN decision. It was actually before the UN had taken the necessary measures to allow the United States to get involved.
The day after it started bombing the Korean peninsula, the US convinced the United Nations to offer what was termed necessary aid to South Korea. The US government also ordered its 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait. The clear intention was to prevent the liberation of Taiwan by Chinese mainland forces.
美国时间6月27号，杜鲁门总统就发表一个公开声明，同时他还讲了一个，就是台湾地位，这个现在还没有定，他的确定等待跟日本合约的签订或由联合国来讨论。
The island of Taiwan had been occupied by the Kuomintang during the Chinese Civil War. By June 1950, the People's Liberation Army was ready to liberate it.
我们的邻国朝鲜发生了内战，你美国凭什么派军队侵犯中国的台湾啊？所以说，他说这是完全毫无道理的，这完全是一个侵略行为。
This was seen as an act against Chinese sovereignty. They believed that China had the rightful governance over Taiwan. But from an American perspective, they could easily ignore this. They knew that the Chinese didn't have the capacity to threaten the 7th Fleet there.
Evidently, the move was part of the US strategy of isolating and surrounding China.
Truman actually gave much greater assistance from that date too to the French in Indochina, where they were fighting against the Viet Minh in a communist insurrection there, as they believed again that the Chinese were going to come into that conflict.
By June 1950, the nascent People's Republic of China was facing threats from many sides.
美国人现在3把刀，第1把刀从朝鲜这边来，是插在我们中国的头上；第2把刀是从台湾这边来，插在我们的腰上；第3把刀，它不是支援在这个法国在越南的殖民战争吗？从越南来，插在我们的脚上。这个天下有变，他就从这几个方面来对付我们。
But the protests by the People's Republic of China, just a year into its existence, fell on deaf ears in the international community.
早在1943年的开罗宣言中间就规定，战后台湾要由日本过去窃取，归还于中国。这个时候你怎么能说台湾地位未定呢？朝鲜本来是他自己的内部事务，你美国出兵朝鲜，你还 侵占了中国领土台湾，那中国人民当然是要坚决反对。
On June the 28th, 1950, 3 days after the start of hostilities in Korea, Mao Zedong gave a speech. In it, he stated that the affairs of each country in the world should be administered by the people of that particular country, and the affairs of Asia should be administered by the Asian people and not by the United States. His remarks prompted people across China to take to the streets and voice their opposition to US aggression. But still, China's relative isolation in 1950 meant that the rest of the world remained largely unaware of its people's outrage. In November of that year, China's special representative to the United Nations, Wu Xiaoquan, raised the matter in a speech to the Security Council. The Korean Civil War cannot in any way justify or excuse America's armed aggression against Taiwan. Dear delegates, Can you imagine Italy having the right to occupy Corsica because of the Spanish Civil War? Can you imagine the United Kingdom having the right to occupy Florida because of the Mexican Civil War? This would be nonsensical and inconceivable. However, China's protests did nothing to slow the US military intervention in Korea's civil war.
¿Usted está buscando una residencia permanente para los Estados Unidos y es profesional en la
Late in the evening of October the 1st, the CPC's core leadership of Mao Zedong, Zhu De, Liu Shaoqi, and Zhou Enlai held an emergency meeting. The sole agenda item was whether China should heed the call from the DPRK and Soviet Union and intervene in the Korean conflict. Mao Zedong and the other leaders barely slept that night. In the early hours of October the 2nd, Mao drafted a telegram to Stalin. He wrote, "We have decided to send part of the armed forces into Korea under the title of Volunteer Army." That afternoon, the CPC Central Committee convened a second, expanded meeting to continue the discussion.
当时这个毛泽东讲嘛，大家先摆不利条件，就是先把这个不利的情况说够。因此呢，这到会的这个领导人呢，大都讲了哪些方面顾虑，比如说军事上哪些顾虑，经济上哪些顾虑，国内安全上哪些顾虑，尤其是大家对这个建设问题顾虑特别大。
Barely a year old at the time, the People's Republic was lagging behind in virtually every field. The country was producing, on average, just over a ton of grain and less than 160 kilos of cotton per hectare. Annual steel production was 158,000 tons. Over 80% of the population was illiterate. On June the 6th, 1950, just 19 days before the outbreak of the Korean War, the Chinese government had launched a new economic plan. Its goal, over a period of 3 years, was to restore the country's economy and finances to their levels in 1936, prior to the full-scale Japanese invasion. China was also in the midst of a reform that would give land free of charge to more than 300 million farmers. In order to speed up the economic recovery and reduce military expenditure, also in June, the Chinese government had announced a major reduction in the army's strength. 1.5 million soldiers were to be demobilized and join the workforce.
全部头一大生产啊，就开始这个马放南山，枪到雨库，都是当兵的呢，都拿起锄头了、镢头大生产。
哎呀，那个地种的，你要就这么说吧，就按那个四部啊，种地也不少啊，不知道种多少。旁地什么人家就是旁地，旁地种地不打钱。
大生产结果呢，土豆都长挺大了，朝鲜战争爆发了。
Life for everyone, from the common soldiers to China's top leaders, was about to be turned on its head.
其实当时还想能争取一线呢不参战的可能，因为那时候我们国家确实真不想打一场战争。那么不参战的前提是什么呢？美军不过38线。
The 38th parallel north, which cuts across the middle of the Korean peninsula, was a manufactured political dividing line. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the leaders of the US, UK, and Soviet Union had decided that once Japan was defeated, the Korean peninsula should be placed under a temporary international trusteeship, pending the establishment of an independent, democratically elected government. On August the 8th, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The next day, its troops entered northeast China. Later in the evening of the same day, at a hurriedly arranged meeting, the US decided that the 38th parallel should be the dividing line between its sphere of influence in South Korea and that of the Soviet Union in the north. However, a line on a map cannot stop an advancing army.
¿Crees que ocupas dinero para invertir en bienes raíces? Mira, yo he comprado propiedades.
By late September 1950, US and South Korean forces were approaching the 38th parallel.
10月1日已经报道了南朝鲜军队已经越过38线了，但是呢，当时中央还有一个底线，如果美军不过38线，那朝鲜人民军抵抗南朝鲜军队，那基本上还是能挡住的。所以说呢，当时中央还争取最后一线希望。
On October the 2nd, after many hours of debate, the CPC leadership had still not reached a consensus on whether Chinese forces should be dispatched to Korea.
大多数人不赞成出兵，就是因为我们困难太多，这也是从我们国家利益考虑吧。
After weighing all the options, Mao Zedong decided against sending the telegram drafted earlier that morning, informing Stalin of China's decision to dispatch troops to Korea. Instead, the message would be to the opposite effect. As Mao Zedong informed Soviet Ambassador Nikolai Roshchin, many comrades in the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China judged that it is necessary to show caution here. If we advance several divisions and the enemy forces us to retreat, and this moreover provokes an open conflict between the USA and China, then our entire plan for peaceful construction will be completely ruined. Significantly, though, Mao also stated that a final decision has not been taken on this question. Subsequently, Mao asked Premier Zhou Enlai to issue a further warning to the US. But because the two countries did not have diplomatic relations, on October the 3rd, Premier Zhou approached Indian Ambassador Kavalam Madhava Panikar with a request that he relay China's message.
向他说明嘛，如果美军不过38线，那我们中国不参战；美军过了38线，我们必须要管。而且周恩来在讲“管”这个字儿之前，跟英语翻译还反复讨论了，用英语哪个词儿，把这个“管”这个词儿表达清楚，让美国真正看清，那中国就是要出兵了。
The Chinese message reached the United States later on October the 3rd. However, the Americans concluded that China was bluffing. Meanwhile, in China, the discussions continued. On October the 4th, a special flight arrived in Beijing. On board was Peng Dehuai, military commander and administrator of northwest China. From the airport, Peng rushed straight to the government compound at Zhongnanhai.
他没有任何思想准备，他认为就是到北京来汇报一下这个大西北的整个建设规划，所以他带了一个大西北建设的规划图啊，甚至连自己的洗漱工具啊都没有带。
It was only when he was in the meeting room at Zhongnan High that Peng learned he'd been summoned to discuss the Korea issue. Peng didn't speak during that meeting. Afterwards, he returned to his hotel room, but he could not sleep. General Peng Dehuai had spent most of his life since the age of 18 on the battlefield. He had earned a reputation for decisive action, but this time he needed time to think. At dawn on October the 5th, Mao called Peng Dehuai back to Zhongnan High. The two men shared a long history. They had fought side by side for over 20 years against the Kuomintang and the Japanese aggressors. Now, once again, Mao was turning to his old comrade in arms.
他就讲，这个美国人侵略我们台湾，威胁我们华东，威胁我们上海；美国人武装干涉朝鲜内战，威胁我们东北。老虎是要吃人的，什么是吃，决定于他的胃肠。那彭德怀的意思就是，这一仗早晚要打，就是你不打他，他可能要打你。
Peng and Mao were of one mind. Long-term strategic importance outweighed any potential temporary losses, and the situation was already precarious. Its northeast region, which borders the Korean peninsula, was a key industrial base for China.
中国的重工业半数在东北。 那么东北的重工业，半数在辽南，都是在，美国侵略朝鲜的飞机和大炮的威胁范围之内。如果我们不出兵，他即便不越过鸭绿江到中国境内来，我们在东北的这些工业基地也没法生产。
The situation on the battlefield was confirming such fears. Beginning in August, American planes had been repeatedly attacking the China-DPRK border region.
经常有美国飞机越过这个鸭绿江，把炸弹扔到中国方面。
8月27号这一天，从上午10点多到下午2点多，就前前后后大概有13架次进入了中国东北边境领空。
If you have a 700 plus credit score, you qualify for Chase's new program where you could access up to a
击伤中国的边民21人，打死3人，然后接到29号，美国的飞机又来，所以从这以后就断断续续的不断，侵入中国领空。
Premier Zhou Enlai lodged several strong protests with the United States over its actions.
From an American perspective, these warnings from Beijing, from Zhou Enlai, came too late. They'd effectively done what they wanted to do. They were going to continue to push on to the border, believing that China wouldn't intervene once this had been achieved. From a US perspective, what could China do? They saw the PRC as very weak, militarily backward in comparison to their own forces. Even if they did intervene, they were very confident they'd be able to push the Chinese back.
The debate on whether to dispatch troops continued on the afternoon of October the 5th. After most of those present had shared their views, it was Peng Dehuai's turn to speak.
彭德怀的意思就是说，如果打烂了，等于我们解放战争晚胜利几年，就是说我们再搞个3年5年建设，那么我们工业上不会有明显的这个成就，那么军队武器装备上也不会有明显的变化。3年5年固然可贵，但是解决不了实际问题。到那个时候，说不定还要打，还要被打得稀烂。与其这样， 晚打不如早打。
Gradually, a consensus was reached.
毛主席也讲过这个话。如果我们不出兵，整个东北就从长白山到鸭绿江这个出口，这就1000多公里，我们边防军将被吸住。边防军还要这个改善装备，另外我要准备打仗，还得在那修机场，那是用小米计算这个经费，那我们要花多少小米？这个账是没法算的。
Millet is a major food crop in northern China. At the time, millions of people depended on it for their livelihood. During the war against Japan, it was said the Chinese Red Army was armed with only millet and rifles. In the early days of the PRC, inflation was so rampant that millet took the role of a currency. The budget drawn up by the Chinese government in 1951 was worth just $2.2 billion US. Even though only 200 million was set aside for the military, China was still prepared to send troops to Korea.
Американские самолеты уже нарушали воздушное пространство Китая, и поэтому у Мао не было сомнений в том, что если Северная Корея падет, американцы и южнокорейцы вполне могут продолжить войну уже против Китая.
当时真是做了准备打烂了的决心。大家这个都讲不利条件嘛，说毛泽东后来总结一下吧，说你们讲的都有道理。但是毛泽东后来也讲嘛，如果让我写出和平建设的理由，可以写出1000条100条，但是不能敌过6个大字，不能置之不理。
After several hours of debate, late in the afternoon of October the 5th, the meeting agreed to support the position of Mao Zedong and Peng Dehuai.
就大家逐渐的形成了一致见，觉得那还是出兵为有利，还是出兵吧。所以叫做抗美援朝保家卫国嘛，不仅仅是为了朝鲜，支援他也是为了我。
On the evening of the following day, October the 6th, Mao Zedong informed Soviet Ambassador Nikolai Roshchin of the Central Committee's decision. At 10 p.m., Roshchin sent a telegram to Stalin. It read, Mao Zedong noted that they are ready to start moving their divisions in the next few days, but he believes it is not appropriate to make haste with this. Although the decision to send troops to Korea had been taken, China's leaders were still waiting for the right opportunity to act.
Déjame te muestro cómo algo tan pequeño como esta figurita que estás viendo.
3 months earlier, a week after US forces had landed in South Korea, Mao had instructed Zhou Enlai to convene a conference on the defense of northeast China. An outcome of these discussions was the decision taken on July the 13th to establish the Northeast Border Army. In August 1950, some 255,000 military personnel, including the entire 13th Corps of the PLA, had set out for the China-DPRK border. Nobody ever wants war. But when their safety is threatened, people feel they have to prepare for it. On October the 7th, American troops crossed the 38th parallel and headed north. The war was coming to China's doorstep. The following day, Mao Zedong issued the order regarding the formation of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. Peng Dehuai was appointed its commander. morning, October the 8th, two people left Beijing, each with an important mission. Peng Dehuai was heading to the front line, and Zhou Enlai was going on a secret trip to the Soviet Union.
我们能不能打？重要一条就是苏联能不能提供物质保障？我们虽然已经下了准备打的决心，但是你空军支援和物质保障不到，我们打的仗也很困难。
China's opponent would be the greatest power in the world, with an incomparably stronger military capability.
1950年，中国的飞机勉强能够作战的只有110多架。中国海军正在组建过程中，装甲部队也是正在这个组建过程中美国一个团的火力是中国一个军的火力还要多。
To confront the greatest military power the world had ever seen, all China could muster was an army of poorly equipped volunteers.
一个班里面，有的人拿3八大盖，子弹是6.5毫米；有的拿这个美30 7.62毫米；有的拿那国民党中正式7.9毫米。一个班的子弹都不能通用，你打起仗来弹药怎么供应？
To resolve the problem, the volunteer army's various corps simply swapped weapons.
比如说，把这个3八大盖全集中起来给38军用，每届的这个美30这些步枪都集中起来给40军用，这样弹药才能供应啊！而且这些弹药国内还没有生产线。
With such a clear disparity in its relative strength with the US, China was obliged to turn to the Soviet Union for assistance. When the Korean War broke out, the Soviet Union had promised China weapons and air support if it intervened. On October the 11th, Premier Zhou Enlai met Stalin. Their talks lasted many hours, from midnight till late morning.
谈的结果，武器装备问题全答应了，但是空军出动养护的问题，斯大林说我们空军还没准备好，2个月到2个半月出动不了，所以这个情况是中共中央10月5号做出决策这个时候没有想到的，谁都没料到。
The news that it would be many weeks before the Soviet Union could provide air support reached Mao Zedong at 3:30 in the afternoon of October the 12th. Stalin concluded his telegram with the words that he awaited Mao's decision as to whether China would move without Soviet air cover.
Я думаю, что Советский Союз, во-первых, не хотел, конечно, конфронтации с Соединенными Штатами. Это раз. То есть и Советский Союз, и Соединенные Штаты, две державы, которые обладали ядерным оружием, балансировали на грани, но каждая сторона считала, что нельзя эту грань переходить.
At 12 minutes past 10 that evening, Mao sent his reply. Our forces have not yet departed. I have ordered the Chinese army to cease all plans to enter Korea. However, within 24 hours, the situation had changed again. On the afternoon of October the 13th, Peng Dehuai was urgently summoned back to Beijing. The Central Committee was once more discussing whether or not to intervene in Korea. Eventually, a unanimous decision was reached. China would send troops with or without Soviet air support.
只不过2个月到2个半月之内没有空军养护，可能我们的困难更大一点，损失也更大一点。但所以说是毛主席还讲了一句，他说，即便打不过，那么我也要打，就是什么时候准备好了以后，我还可以继续打。这反映毛主席有决心，就是为了我们国家利益， 我们即便再弱，我也得反抗一下他，不能挺着脖子让你杀呀。
That same day, Mao sent a telegram to Zhou Enlai, who was still in the Soviet Union. In it, he informed the premier, "We believe that we should and must enter this war. The benefits of doing so are great, as are the costs of staying out." On October the 14th, senior military leaders, including Mao Zedong and Peng Dehuai, finalized the detailed battle plan. The 260,000 troops of the volunteer army were to set out on October the 19th and complete the crossing of the Yalu River within 10 days. While Mao and other Chinese leaders were laying their plans, US forces were pushing towards Pyongyang.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. This is Muhammad Ashmawi, Human Appeal CEO.
The Americans were scenting victory. Following intelligence reports that the Chinese volunteer army was on the move, President Truman flew to Wake Island in the Pacific. In a meeting with General MacArthur, the two men discussed whether China was likely to enter the war.
"麦克阿瑟讲嘛，这战争已经赢了，中国人已经错过了最佳的干涉时机了。所以麦克阿瑟认为中国人不太可能参战了。他认为如果参战的话，首先是他们得不到空中掩护。如果在得不到空中掩护的情况下南下平壤，那就会面临着战史上最大的一场屠杀。"
MacArthur's confidence is entirely understandable. The United States outmatched China in virtually every field. However, the Americans underestimated China's determination to defend its interests. Since the 1840s, China had experienced one humiliation after another at the hands of Western powers. Impoverished and weak, it had suffered many invasions, paid vast sums in reparations, and seen foreign armies march unopposed across its territory. War was nothing new for China. During the 14-year Japanese invasion, the country had fought back from the brink of defeat. In 1938, while living in a cave in Shanxi province, Mao Zedong had written the book On Protracted War. In it, he pointed out that weapons are not the decisive factor in war. It is people, not things, that are decisive. One day in August 1946, during China's Civil War, American journalist Anna Louise Strong interviewed Mao in Yan'an. In his remarks, the Chinese leader famously dismissed reactionaries as paper tigers. He went on to say, "The outcome of a war is decided by the people, not by one or two new types of weapon." In 1950, China was once again facing a battle for survival. But this time, the enemy was a global superpower.
谁不想过一个太平生活，搞经济建设，都想过好日子嘛。现在敌人硬要我们侵略我们嘛，要把我们要掐死我们中华人民共和国在摇篮里头嘛，我们刚成立嘛。
抗美援朝保家卫国了，要雨过咱们再晚出国到亚人家儿，那就人家说啥，人说打你哪，打你哪就打你哪呀。
Nobody wants to go to war or to give up their life needlessly. Until recently, China had been a semi-colony. But now its poorest people had been given their own land for the first time. No one was ready to have their dreams of a better life shattered. The call to resist America, aid Korea, and protect the motherland reverberated throughout China. People donated money and supplies to support the effort to resist the U.S. aggression.
你美国占了我领土台湾，把战火烧到鸭绿江边，那么我非打不可了。就全国人民参加抗美援朝，同仇敌忾，青年人3000万人报名，几亿人捐款捐物支援抗美援朝。我也问老一代人呢，我说当年入朝的时候有没有顾虑？他说看到美国的飞大炮确实也有顾虑，但是呢，首先是我们的这个人民的支持压倒那个恐惧感，压倒的思想顾虑，而且真还是把美国当成纸老虎，没有这个气概怎么能打呢
？A mí nadie me dio permiso de vivir la vida que yo siempre soñé. Fui por ella.
The images show the volunteer army preparing for war. The men helping the medics across the frozen terrain did so knowing full well that they might be returning on the same stretchers they were carrying. The young soldiers were fully aware of what was awaiting them on the battlefield. They knew how strong the United States was. And yet, they pressed on. Henry Kissinger, in his book On China, discussed why China was willing to send troops to Korea. What was most unlikely was Chinese acquiescence in an American presence at a border that was a traditional invasion route into China, and specifically the base from which Japan had undertaken the occupation of Manchuria and the invasion of northern China. China was all the less likely to be passive when such a posture involved a strategic setback on two fronts, the Taiwan Strait and Korea. By October the 17th, 2 days before its planned entry into Korea, the volunteer army was ready and awaiting final orders. Then, out of the blue, a message arrived from the Soviet Union. Stalin had changed his mind again.
斯大林这时候他的态度又发生了变化啊，他就说，如果你们资金不足呢？用贷款的形式是可以的，而且武器是以出厂价的半价来卖给你们啊。但是对于苏联空军出兵的这个问题，他又产生了动摇。他就说：“我可以出兵，但是我不能过这个鸭绿江。”那么周恩来同志讲，就是你如果不过鸭绿江，那还叫什么参战？
Stalin's refusal to provide air support meant that the volunteer army would be completely unprotected the moment it left Chinese territory. The soldiers would be horribly exposed to the American artillery. By this time, U.S. forces, under orders from General MacArthur, were pushing north at full speed towards the Yalu River and the China-DPRK border. Already, Pyongyang was under siege. When the news reached China, Mao Zedong sent an urgent message to Peng Dehuai, ordering him to postpone the crossing of the Yalu and to return to Beijing. On October the 18th, the Central Committee held another meeting. It was attended by Premier Zhou Enlai, who was back from the Soviet Union.
当周恩来这时候飞回北京，向中央说明了这个谈判的情况，说武器装备还有保障，但是呢，出动空军是没有指望了。这毛泽东又是反复考虑。
Главной проблемой было время, потому что если бы китайские войска опоздали, возможно, ситуация развернулась бы гораздо хуже. И, видимо, Мао это понимал. К сожалению, война далеко не всегда ведется так, что ты полностью к ней готов.
A nation that had only just emerged from one war was under pressure to enter another. The fate of the Chinese nation was hanging in the balance. The decision was a very difficult one, but once taken, it would be irrevocable. Many years later, Peng Dehuai recalled something Mao Zedong said before finally settling on a decision. Even if we cannot beat America, they will be beholden to us. We can fight them again if we so wish. Throughout the war, the US never really appreciated how determined the Chinese people were to defend their motherland. Mao Zedong himself referred to the strength of their resolve in February 1953, when the war was in its third year.
时间要打多久？我看我们不要做决定，或者是有党的难民，或者哪个的将来的什么政权由他们去决定。就是说，他们要打多久就打多久，一直打到完全胜利。
At 6 p.m. on October the 19th, 4 Army Corps and 3 artillery divisions of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army crossed the Yalu River. The soldiers were young and mostly uneducated, but they knew that with every step forward, they were defending peace in the motherland they were leaving behind.
¿Te ha pasado alguna vez escuchar una canción en inglés, no entender mucho o casi nada, pero luego cuando miras la letra entiendes todas las palabras que hay?
Mao 主席号召抗美援朝保家卫国，那也不在乎，出国就出国，不是说这才当兵害怕，没有。
毛主席说。 你打你的原子弹，我打我的手榴弹，这毛主席的原话。
就是从雨桥一直到最后，就没想着，就没有这么一个心呢。我将来我活着回中国，都抱着一死拉倒，都是抱这么个态度。你说不理解，当兵的人呢，只有战争年代呀。 只要打起仗的时候，那个时候就没想着活。